Welcome everyone. My name is Simmons Bunton. I am the editor-in-chief here at terrain.org. And I'm going to admit somebody real quickly. You'll see me doing that as I give my little terrain.org spiel and otherwise. I'm here in Tucson, Arizona, where I respectfully acknowledge my presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the O'odham and the Yaqui, as well as the beautiful saguaro and creosote populated valleys, hills, and arroyos nestled between the Santa Catalina, Rincon, Santa Rita, Tortolita, and Tucson mountains. So welcome to our Women Writing the West reading. I'm so excited you're joining us today. I want to give a big thank you to our host, Leonora Simonovis, who is our currents or editorials editor, and to our readers this evening, who will read in this order: Kathryn Wilder, and then Kathryn Smith, and then Melissa Sevigny, whose book, Brave the Wild River, the Untold Story of Two Women Who Mapped the Botany of the Grand Canyon, publishes tomorrow. Very exciting. So congratulations, Melissa. Okay, if your connection becomes slow, you may want to turn off your video. I heard that helps. In all cases, please remain muted. But you're welcome to post your questions and other positive feedback in the chat, and I'm sure we'll open it up to audio questions during the Q&A that follows tonight's reading. We are recording this, as you know, in all readings and conversations, and we'll make those available from terrain.org and our YouTube channel soon, usually within a few days. We'd love it if you would officially follow our YouTube channel too, which is at youtube.com/c/terrain.org, although I think actually you can get there without typing in the C, so youtube.com/terrain.org. But let me just put it there in the chat for you in case you want to hop over, not during the reading, but sometime, and subscribe. So this is our third online reading of 2023, and we'll host an in-person reading in Portland, Oregon on July 9th at 8 p.m. at the Architectural Heritage Center in conjunction with the ASLE AESS conference. And that reading features, hold on, let me admit these folks. That reading features Teresa May Chuk, Jasmine Elizabeth Smith, Derek Sheffield, and Joe Wilkins. Again, that's in person. Further details will be available on terrain.org soon, as well as our Facebook page, and announced to be our e-newsletter, which you should subscribe to if you don't subscribe to it now, from terrain.org, or from this link right here. You can subscribe to our e-newsletter. Okay, now a few announcements, if I may. In other words, about terrain.org, the world's first and longest publishing online journal of place, celebrating 25 years of publishing this year. Yay! Okay, those words will commence after I admit this person. Okay, and I admit that person. Great. So first, our contest submission period is open now and closes on September 4th, which is Labor Day here in the US. Our contest this year is judged by Ross Gay for poetry, Tony Jensen for nonfiction, and Talia Lakshmi Kalluri for fiction. That's a $20 entry for a $1,000 grand prize in each genre, plus $200 to finalists. Speaking of finalists, Kathryn Wilder is a finalist of this most recent nonfiction contest. All entries are considered for publication. The reading period for the second annual Sowell Emerging Writers Prize, with a prize of $1,000 in publication by Texas Tech University Press for a full book this year of poetry, is September 15th to November 15th, and that's a $25 entry fee. And all submission information is available, of course, from the terrain.org website, which is at that link in chat. Okay, so finally, many thanks to those of you who donated to support terrain.org in our recent spring fundraiser. Those donations are going directly to paying contributors, as well as our readers in our series, such as Melissa, Kathryn, and Kathryn this evening. Of course, as a 501c3 tax-exempt organization, we'll gladly accept your tax-deductible, depending on your status, donation at any time, which, let me just throw that right there in the chat as well. What a multitasker I am. Okay, now enough about that stuff. Let's turn to tonight's reading, which again will be followed by a Q&A. I'll be posting terrain.org and book links in the chat in support of our readers this evening. So keep an eye out for those. Also, be sure to post your thoughts and questions in chat as we look forward to an engaging conversation following the readings. And finally, thank you again for joining us. It's my pleasure now to introduce our host this evening, Leonora Simonovis. Leonora is a Venezuelan-American poet, editor, and professor of Latin American literature and creative writing in Spanish at the University of San Diego. Her debut collection is called Study of Rap. And let me just post the link to that because we don't want to leave you out. You can go and purchase that because that book won the 2021 Colorado Prize for Poetry and received honorable mention at the 2022 International Latino Book Award. Her poems consider the intersections of language, identity, and spirituality in connection to the environment and to her experiences as an exile. So be sure to check that out. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in DMQ Review, Rivermouth Review, Verse Daily, Quelly, Diode Poetry Journal, Tinderbox Poetry Journal, and The Rumpus, among others. She is the reviews editor at Eco Theo Review and the currents editor at terrain.org. So Leo, thank you for joining us to celebrate women writing the West and for hosting what I know will be a wonderful reading and discussion with Melissa Sevigny, Kathryn Smith, and Kathryn Wilder. Take it away.
Thank you, Simmons, for that lovely introduction. And thank you everyone for being here. Welcome. Happy Monday. It's wonderful that you made the time today to join us and to just like bask in some really wonderful readings. I'll just go ahead and introduce our first reader, who is Kathryn Wilder. And I'm actually starting this introduction with wonderful news. Kathryn Wilder won the 2023 Ellen Malloy Award for Desert Writers, and her memoir, congratulations, Desert Chrome, Water, a Woman, and Wild Horses in the West, won a Colorado Book Award, a Nautilus Book Award, and others. Her essays have been cited in Best American Essays and have appeared in terrain.org, High Desert Journal, High Country News, River Teeth, Fourth Genre, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts and lives among Mustangs in southwestern Colorado, where she ranches with her family in the Dolores River watershed. The subject of her next book. Please join me in welcoming Kathryn Wilder.
Aloha. Thank you, Simmons, for the invitation to be here, and thank you for all your great faces and names in the audience there. I'm going to read just a teeny bit from one chapter and then go to In the Pen, and this is from Desert Chrome. I dream I am underwater, slipping, spinning, sliding, swimming, gliding through water. I can breathe here. The man I'm with in the dream doesn't know this about me, that I can breathe underwater. But the man in the dream is like Harrison Ford and not afraid of anything. He follows me into the water. We partner like dolphins, surfacing occasionally. No fear, just beauty. After all these months of watching Mustangs in the wild, Chrome and his mares, other bands, young bachelor stallions, the old solo stallions often hidden in the fringes, I know that for the full story, I must see Mustangs in captivity. It's time. TJ, Pat, and I follow the Arkansas River through the wet mountains of the Rockies to Canyon City for a tour of the East Canyon Correctional Complex, where a short-term BLM holding facility functions within the federal pen. Purses, cameras, cell phones, and pocket knives locked away in the BLM field office. We get briefed on prison protocol, instructed not to make eye contact and certainly not conversation with the prisoners. And we're loaded into a van and escorted inside. Only inside this part of the prison is actually outside. 80 acres of corrals, barns, arenas, round pens, tack rooms, and offices. Well, there are men aplenty, from our tour guide, wild horse and burro specialist, Fran Ackley, to inmates all around. We are the only women present, and we are here to see horses. Yet I can't help but notice the men, flashbacks to my earlier life. I might have ended up in prison myself. I just didn't get caught. And here I am looking at horses and men who did. Fran stops the van at the outline pens where the older ladies and gents await sanctuary space like our human elders waiting to get into assisted living. Ages 7 and up, these Mustangs are deemed unadoptable and kept at the outskirts. Orange-clad prisoners drive flatbed trucks weighted down with half-ton alfalfa bales into the pens. As horses crowd around the hay, the pecking order is easy to see. In the wild, the social structure of family bands helps the species survive, like wolf packs. But wolves are predators running to kill, and horses are prey. They run for safety. Within the confines of this prison, some cannot run far enough away, the submissive standing off to the side while the dominant geldings and mares follow the feed trucks closely. Within this prison, there is a social order to the men as well, one we can't see, their survival also dependent on functioning within that order. Shivering in my down jacket in the February frost, I wonder where I am. At one time, a dominant mare fighting my way through life. After getting clean, was I lead mare with Smith and my kids with Rebecca? What of the times when my nature was buried in addiction or a tough marriage or grief? What then? Following TJ and Pat back into the van, suppressing the synopses firing in the presence of so many hardened men, I remind myself that we're here to see horses. And we do, moving on to the training facilities where inmates who are part of the Wild Horse Inmate Program do groundwork with some horses and ride others. Now it's okay to watch. The younger adoptable Mustangs live near the training facilities and main alleyway, horses waiting for someone to fall in love and rescue them. Leaving the van and men behind, we walk between pens. The horse smells powerful and comforting in the cold of the story. All these horses removed from their homes and waiting here for what? Mostly for the feed wagon or the warmth of sunshine, though some wait to hide again while others wait for some kind of distraction. Fran shows us hundreds of Mustangs, thousands actually. 2,901, says the handwriting on a blackboard on the office wall. Individual horses stand out as we move between pens of mares and geldings, yearlings and mature horses, beautiful grays, bays, buckskins, duns, roans, pintos, sorrels. With wild manes and searching eyes, they burst into movement, racing across the pens, then settle. Some come close to investigate us as we observe them. There are many in between, many men as well. I avert my eyes. Onward to the next pen, our collective hearts heavy. Unlike many of the human inmates, these horses did nothing to earn this fate but be born. We approach another pen. Through the corral fence, we watch young Mustangs sparring like boys, rearing and jabbing with their front hooves. At sight of us, they charge away, beautiful in their shaggy winter coats, then trot back, tails and heads high, breath steamy. There are 35 Mustang geldings in the pen, the muscle and fire of youth rippling through them, and in all that movement, I spy him, and I swear he is looking at me. The voices around me fade, people disappear, horses blur. A dozen young geldings crowd the fence. The big bay stands back, watching us, watching me. TJ says something to Pat. I don't hear the words. May I go in? I ask Fran. Sure, he says, trusting that I know something about Mustangs. Before he finishes nodding, I'm climbing the fence, careful, though, to move quietly to find the liquid motion of my human body. Some horses spook anyway, and 35 young, mostly untouched by human horses from the high desert west move through the pen with the power of wild water. I stand in the current, hands up in front of the near horses' faces to slow the flow. Some stop, others pivot away, and a few don't care, crowding me. Behind the near geldings, the big bay reflects my stance, solid yet ready to flee. But I can see his eyes beneath his shaggy forelock, stillwater pools, calm, inquisitive. His thick coat almost as dark as his black mane and tail. He has a white hind pastern and a white star on his forehead. Around his muzzle and eyes, a soft tan glows, even his eyebrows, like a Doberman. But he isn't built sleek like a Doberman and doesn't behave like one. He's built like a quarter horse. Of course he is. I have loved quarter horses since girlhood. He watches as I move among the frisky 3-year-olds, standing his ground warily while allowing my presence. My breath slows, becoming more surface, careful, like breathing underwater. In the presence of power and grace, I remember I can do it. Breathe underwater, breathe in the bodies of the horses in this pen like a huge Olympic swimming pool, wild horses, and I quiet my heart to match my breath, match my steps so as not to startle him. Any of them in the cold of a February day in Colorado, as across the backs of other young geldings, he watches me. I feel his eyes underwater. I am swimming underwater, and step by slow step, I take 3 toward him, and the other geldings part, giving us room. I remove my glove and in slow motion, lift my hand toward him, lifting and reaching through air, electric with his brace and breath as he watches me, leaning not away, but toward me. My hand out, relaxed, palm down, submissive yet inquiring. His neck stretches as far from his chest as it can, while his feet stand steady, his nostrils searching the air, tasting for danger, and the Mustang's muzzle and my hand enter a space where everything turns liquid like dance, and we are dancing as he reaches farther, and I do too, and he sniffs the back of my wrist, warm breath and whiskers on my skin. When he tenses, I feel it, see it. His body taut, quivering, not in fear, but with the effort it takes this big animal from the wild flanks of Wyoming to not wheel away and run, to not wheel around and run away, to stay. I lower my hand slowly and take half a step back, take a breath, a moment. His strong chest leans toward me again, while again his feet don't move, and I have forgotten the other horses in the pen and the people outside as my hand lifts and the muscles in his stout body relax as he reaches still farther with his nose. In movement as slow as my heart, my breath, I lift my hand and turn it so my fingers loosely cup and hold the air between us, and I reach with them toward him, and I feel it then, feel his soft muzzle with my fingertips. He accepts the touch, his first voluntary human touch, and the warmth of his breath, his spirit, his gentle nature fills me. When I step back and to the side, he moves too, not away, but following me, mirroring my movements, even with the other geldings intervening. He follows as I step slowly here and there, backward, forward in the spirit water air bubble that holds us. He has hooked on. From the far side of the fence, TJ says he likes you, and I feel a smile rising inside. an internal sun drying up any leftover fear. The Mustang's mana has remained intact, his prowess and spirit, and I have hooked on. I don't know how long we dance, too long, for I'm part of people on tour and we need to move on. I could stay in this pen of Mustangs for the next several hours, all night, but for the cold. TJ would stay too. Watching Mustangs is what she does. Watching wild horses is the best medicine, like watching a river or the flames of a campfire burning low in the night. The calm stays with me, but is tempered with sadness as we drive away from all those horses. In their midst, I felt something either new or very old. We were all children once, or foals trotting freely beside our wild mothers. All those Mustangs and men and me were someone before. Who was I before somebody's hands changed how I saw the world? Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. That was lovely. And that ending was so beautiful. I was just like enthralled when you were describing the relationship with the horse and how it was like push and pull, coming close, but not quite. It's just beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So just an invitation for our audience to put some love in the chat for our readers today. Could be comments, could be something that engaged you from the reading, a line, a phrase. I'm sure they'd love to hear from you. And I'll go ahead and introduce our second reader, Kathryn Smith. Kathryn Smith's most recent poetry collection, Self-Portrait with Cephalopod, published by Milkweed Editions in 2021, won the Jake Adam York Prize and was a finalist for the Washington State Book Award. She has received awards from Artists Trust, Spokane Arts, and the Allied Arts Foundation, and her poems and visual poetry have appeared or are forthcoming in Diagram, Copper Nickel, Ninth Letter, Fugue, Gettysburg Review, RHINO, Brink, and elsewhere. And you can read her pushcart nominated poems in terrain.org, and I'm sure Simmons will share that link. Welcome, Kathryn.
Thank you. I am going to start with a few poems from Self-Portrait with Cephalopod. It came out in 2021 during the pandemic, and then I'm going to read one of the poems that was published in terrain.org. Creation myth. And the Lord said, let ants be fed from the egg caps of walking stick insects that hatch disguised as ants. Let impostors pass undetected from a subterranean nest. Let fur-bound beasts carry exoskeletal beasts from one hinged continent to another, and let land bridges break. Let humans break land and build bridges from elements dug from the land. Let rats unhinge ribs from spines and climb through pipes invented by humans to keep our shit and nakedness away from the shit and nakedness of rats. Let humans set poisoned traps. And thus, I tell you, an erroneous vision of heaven and hell shall come to you in books, and this will divide you. Some will say it's possible for a child to die and come back from death, having seen the realm of God. But some will say, what does it matter when earth is a lonely chasm where children die unnoticed, as we sharpen our knives and whiten our teeth and tighten our skin and implore our screens to refresh. I live in Eastern Washington State on the ancestral homeland of the Spokane people. And we have increasingly become familiar with what we call smoke season. There's a period of the summer when wildfires have become so regular that we just know that there's going to be a time when you might not want to spend too much time outside. So wildfire and drought are continually just a regular part of life. And this next poem is sort of about going about just daily activities of regular life in that context. Today is the day I will stand shirtless before the machine as it compresses each breast between two plates. My reward for turning 40. My God, it's hot out, and I have to walk the 10 blocks to the imaging center without antiperspirant so that no errant metal seeping through the permeable membrane we call skin can skew the image or expose my vulnerable tissues to additional unknown risk. Smoke from distant wildfires has been clinging to the sky for days now. I think I want to stop breathing, blinking too. This morning, I washed with water siphoned from my neighbor, transported by a hose linking my house to hers, because someone from the city dug a hole in my yard and closed the valve. But I haven't showered, I thought, as though that mattered more than a foundation's seeping cracks. I know a leaking pipe in August is basically a faucet left running in a drought. Imagine the cancers I will hypothetically absorb today. Aluminum leaching toward my breasts, chemicals finding my pores as water bounces off my skin, airborne particulates landing on the sponge of my lungs. Today is the day, and yesterday, and tomorrow. It'll be a while before the planet dies, and meanwhile, we have to live here. Let's all make ourselves comfortable while we can, is one way to argue this inevitability. Let's sit in the stench of our bodies for the sake of the children, whose stinking bodies need a planet to sit on too, is another. What camp I'm in changes daily, sometimes by the hour. I don't know why mammograms make me contemplate apocalypse. The end will come at us like an uncomfortable procedure that exists to detect dangers brought on by other dangers we do nothing to quell. Mostly I'm resigned to it, doing what I can when it suits me. It's too hot and smoky to walk, so my friend is letting me borrow her Prius. I have a very curious cat in the room who bumped my table a little during that previous poem. So if she interrupts again, that's a jumble. So like I said, I live in Eastern Washington, but I grew up in Western Washington in the 1980s, and my dad was employed in the timber industry. And that industry underwent a lot of change during that time. When there was increased scrutiny around clear cutting, awareness about endangered species and habitat loss. And I think that for me, growing up with that kind of conflict going on really shaped how I view my relationship to the environment. So that comes into play in this next poem. And my dad worked in sawmills and for a while in a paper mill that made brown paper bags. This is called Sulfur. Begins with an epigraph from Johann Richter. You can fool a man, but not a machine. When the machine is willful, you have to find out why. Johann Richter had a vision, a machine that never sleeps, digesting wood chips ad infinitum, steam and salt and sodium sulfide, breaking cellulose down to its elemental self in the very model of efficiency. The resulting product, thanks to Richter, would never be inconsistent. No more would the white plumes rising from the waterfront mill cease. I was 9 years old and already staring down a horizon that continually manufactured clouds. Thank Johann Richter for the sky's perpetuity, the sulfurous air I breathed as I pedaled the neighborhood. Thank him for the machinery my father oiled at any necessary hour to ensure the digester's endless chugging. For swing shifts and graveyard shifts, my sister crying when he left for the mill, not knowing when she'd see him. Thank Richter for work and for lack of work, for union strikes and layoffs, for the first move, the second. Thank him for fooling us. The devil, as they say, is in the details. Sulfur is another word for brimstone, that belching hell stench so many preachers slam their fists over. But thanks to Johann Richter, we know better. We know the God is in the machine, and necessity is the mother of invention. Consider the Taoists. In their search for a potion to achieve immortality, they concocted instead an explosive powder that revolutionized the face of war. Technology spreads quickly, even when it's born of irony. It's in our chemical makeup, in the sulfur we all hold in our bodies, more than the oceans hold, more than the earth's crust, though it shifts and shrugs and spews its brimstone fireworks skyward. Every beauty is a byproduct of danger. Water seeps beneath the surface and bubbles up again, warmed by minerals and sulfur, in the hot springs that soothed my mother's pre-arthritic joints before the real deterioration set in. Johann Richter can't really be blamed. Surely he never imagined we'd see an end to these trees or find another way to carry what's necessary. There's such a smooth reliability to paper. Our sacks filled with hot dog buns and styrofoam cups, we'd hike a mile into the forest and sit in the hot springs mud before someone found a way to redirect the healing waters closer to the road, built pools encased in concrete, and pumped the water in. They thought it more civilized, though despite the locker rooms and showers to scrub our skin and hair, we still went home smelling like something rotten. I'm gonna take a quick sip of water. I'm gonna read one last poem. This was published in terrain.org. So thank you to Simmons and Derek and everyone there. And this was inspired by a visit to a taxidermy museum on the campus of Washington State University. And it starts with a line from Emily Dickinson. Emily says the heart has many doors. So I opened the one marked museum, found myself face to face with a field of dead deer. Of all the pelts I touched, the skunk's was softest, softer than the square of brown bear, softer than the river otter, bereft of its disastrous teeth. I could have sworn a bird flitted from one branch to another, but it was just my lone reflection in the display case. I saw 2 magpies that day, one pecking at pavement for edible scraps as I watched through the diner window, scraping mayonnaise from my vegetable sandwich. The other perched in an avian tableau. I looked it in the eye, which is what the YouTube videos say to do to avoid attack. If magpies are among the animals that recognize their reflections, would they know their kind through museum glass? The heart has many doors, but few windows. Eye pressed to the knothole, ears pulsing with white noise buzz. I studied every specimen in that wilderness of preserved beasts, as though I've never crouched on a trail, arms flung to shield my head from a puffed grouse protecting her chicks. I looked every dangerous thing in the teeth, the wolverine, the cougar, the bear, so like the one that once rose to meet me at the edge of a river. It was so long ago, I had almost forgotten how every door in my heart flew open in that moment. "You're beautiful," I shouted over and over. It's the first time I remember wanting to be alive. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That was beautiful. You have tons of comments and love in the chat, so you can head on over and read some of those. All right, so our third reader is Melissa L. Sevigny. She is the author of 3 books of nonfiction, most recently, Brave the Wild River, the untold story of 2 women who mapped the botany of the Grand Canyon, published by W.W. Norton, which is going to, and the book's going to be published May 23rd of 2023, so tomorrow. Her essays and poems have appeared in Orion, Atavist Magazine, Sierra Magazine, and elsewhere. She has an MFA in creative writing and environment from Iowa State University and a BS in environmental science from the University of Arizona. She lives in Flagstaff, Arizona, and you can read nonfiction interviews and other work by Melissa in terrain.org. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Here's the book. Yes, it's going to be published tomorrow. I'm super excited to do my first reading here with Terrain folks. I feel like this is kind of home for me. So thank you all for being here. I have a cat sleeping on my lap, so I'm going to try to do this without disturbing him too much. I'm going to skip ahead and read a part in the middle of this book. I think all you really need to know is that this is the story of 2 botanists, Elzada Clover and Lois Jotter, who ran the Colorado River in 1938 to make a plant collection. And at this point in the story, they've already run through Cataract and Glen Canyon, which of course was not underneath the dam as it is today. And they've just entered the Grand Canyon, and they've had a pretty difficult trip so far. A few of their crew members have up and left at Lee's Ferry, and they had to recruit some new ones very last minute. So they're finally there in the Grand Canyon at the time that the scene opens. There were many stories about the Grand Canyon. Some of them were true. Powell's crew hadn't half expected the river to plunge over waterfalls and disappear into underground tunnels for hundreds of miles at a stretch. His expedition proved this wasn't the case, but nightmare tales lingered. People said that if you traveled too deep into the chasm, you could look up at midday and see the stars. It was rumored that whole plateaus inside of the canyon had been cut off from the outside world for so long that primordial monsters still roamed there, relics of a ferocious past. The few scientific expeditions that had ventured inside, a few by river, the others on foot, came out with more fancy than fact. They spoke of a fabulously rich silver mine that nobody could find, and herds of feral horses no bigger than coyotes. They told campfire stories of a petrified man whose form shone out clearly from the canyon wall. And why not? The sculpted stone sometimes did look like it was trying to form living shapes, fluted into scales or fur by the constant wear of water. Strange squid-like things jetted their way inside the limestone, which was made of a million tiny sea creatures whose bodies had dissolved in the ancient ocean. Put an ear up against the wall, and maybe you'd hear the sloshing of long-vanished waves. Many people talked about the oppressive, claustrophobic feeling of the walls closing in overhead, blotting out sunlight, casting long purple shadows over the endlessly churning river. The Grand Canyon of Arizona, wrote John L. Stoddard, is nature wounded unto death and lying stiff and ghastly, with a gash 200 miles in length and a mile in depth in her bared breast. That was one description in a collection of essays published by the Santa Fe Railroad in 1902. The book was meant to promote tourism, a plan that may have backfired because none of the writers could agree on whether the Grand Canyon was gorgeous or horrifying. C.A. Higgins called it a chaotic underworld, just emptied of primeval floods. Another visitor summed up his experience in a burst of feeling: horror, tragedy, silence, death, chaos. Lois Jotter had dismissed these overblown descriptions before the trip. She told her father the Grand Canyon couldn't possibly be worse than the gray cliffs of Yosemite because the difference between 3,000 and 5,000 feet can't be appreciated much as difference, she wrote. Of course, there was a difference. In Yosemite, she had slept safe on the gentle surface of the earth and looked up at the mountains. Now she was trapped in a mile-deep crack with no way out but through. The boats drifted between deep red walls, which, when lit by morning sun, turned pale gold layered on rose. Windows and doorways opened high on the cliffs, as if built for gods or angels, bits of blue sky showing through. In some places, rocks were stacked as neatly as if by a bricklayer. In others, they made a disordered jumble, like a child's tower kicked to pieces. It was a place to overwhelm and bewilder the senses. Fragrances so strong they had texture, colors so bright they rang like harp strings plucked by long, nimble fingers of sunlight. One could be forgiven for thinking this was all there was to this place: stone, water, and sky. Also, 3 little boats, suspended between these elements and wholly at their mercy. But Jotter made no mention of harrowing depths or ghastly colors in her journal. Her attention was all on plants. They clung to the talus slopes or fringed the river's edge, a sparse scattering of agave, yucca, and 4-winged saltbush, with the occasional hackberry or redbud tree. The 2 botanists snatched up specimens whenever they could. They gathered samples of Mexican devilweed, tall green stems topped with white flowers, which grew thickly on the cobble bars, and of twining snapdragon, a plant with rambling tendrils and magenta blossoms shaped like pursed lips waiting for a kiss. On the river, there were long stretches of slow water, split by rollicking rapids. Norm Nevels, who's the trip's leader, his personal scale ranged from a bit tricky to dangerous to damn rough, but he had no more serious complaints about the crew. Bill Gibson had faced his nightmares, and Lauren Bell proved a natural with the oars. Del Reed, another one of the new crew members, wasn't so adept, but he pitched in willingly on camp chores. He woke early to kindle the campfire and showed the others how to bury a can of beans in the hot coals before bed so it would be piping hot for breakfast. There were no more arguments. Jotter vented her feelings about Neville's poor leadership by filling a whole page in her journal shortly after leaving Lee's Ferry, but outwardly she kept her composure. Neville's thawed enough towards Jotter to admit that she was a good scout. Elzada Clover was relieved. She wrote that Jotter was splendid, in spite of those miserable days of whispering. We are trying to forget and forgive that. In fact, they concealed their differences so well that the newer members of the crew seemed to have little inkling of the earlier unhappiness. The gang could not have had wider interests, Reed mused, and yet it seemed to me that a band of friendship came to us that could not have come under any other circumstances. On July 15th, they pitched camp on a sandbar half buried in driftwood. Bell created a table out of a 12-foot piece of waterlogged lumber washed down from who knows where. The spot had an overhanging ledge to shelter them in a pinch if it rained. The Redwall limestone had appeared, pale white shelves stained crimson from iron oxide seeping down from the layers above. It had formed beneath a shallow sea more than 300 million years before, and fossil traces of sponges, sea lilies, and corals made a faded palimpsest within the stone. It was Clover's turn to cook dinner while Jotter collected specimens. By the way, the women did all the cooking on this trip for everybody in the crew. She scrambled up the talus slopes in search of plants. Apache plume was all over the hillside. Its pink, feathery flowers looked straight out of some fairyland, grafted to the end of dry, knobby sticks. Agaves were common too, silhouetted on the ridges above her like astonished porcupines. She cut a few leaves from a particularly fine specimen with a 12-foot stalk. Leaves was a misleading word. Agaves grew in rosettes of fleshy blue-green swords, toothed all the way to the tips. Wallapai prized the plant for its heart, sweet as molasses when roasted in hot coals. In fact, a rare species of agave with long, lush leaves grows nowhere but the Grand Canyon, probably a cultivar, introduced and tended by native people and planted close to roasting pits. That species of agave was unknown to Western botany in Jotter's time. The specimen she collected, Utah agave, is common in the Southwest. It is also called the century plant because people said it flowered just once in a century, a poetical exaggeration. The plant usually sends up a flowering stalk when it is between 20 and 40 years of age. The big yellow blossoms turn the top of the stalk into a flaming torch for a few days or a week, drawing in a paparazzi of bats and buzzing bees. Then the stalk falls and the plant dies.
This agave was odd. It had red spines, bright red, not the usual brown burgundy color. Curious, Jotter thought. She looked closer. Then she realized that her hands were cut and bleeding. The red was my contribution, she wrote in her journal. Night had fallen by the time she returned to camp. The others had eaten dinner without her. Jotter pressed her specimens in a light sprinkle of rain. Later, she had a cup of hot tea and nibbled on leftovers, feeling sorry for herself. The cuts on her hands had scabbed over, her nails worn blunt and grimed from the day's work. Fine sand filtered into her clothing and hair. But that night, she dreamed of pressing plants in sleeves of newspaper. Clover, snugged in beside her under the shelter of the overhanging ledge, heard her mutter, "It's just wonderful." "What is?" Clover asked. "I made a wonderful collection," Jotter said, and Clover realized she was talking in her sleep. The rain cleared, but the air was sweltering even now, hours after the sun had descended behind the canyon walls. In the night, Clover woke with a start. A noise had startled her. Was the river rising? She climbed out of her bedroll and went to look. The river was rising a little, but the boats were safely moored. She stood spellbound by the moonlight drifting down the cliffs, a play of silver light and deep shadow. Belle woke too and came to join her at the river's edge. They stood silent beneath the cold glow of the stars, watching the nearest rapid curl and froth, playful as an otter. Finally, Clover crawled back into her bedroll, feeling her air mattress deflate by slow inches. She'd lost the plug some time before. "The night was so beautiful that I couldn't sleep," she wrote in her journal. She had been warned about the Grand Canyon, its oppressive walls and gloomy crags, and how the sound of water striking rock preyed on travelers' minds. She found, instead, a nameless beauty. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was wonderful. I was so focused on the story that I was like, oh wait, she's still. I just wanted to keep going. So before we have a Q&A right after this, but before we go into the Q&A, why don't we give another round of applause, snaps or emojis, whatever you feel like, to our readers again. Thank you. So lovely. All right, so we'll open it up for questions. I'm just gonna fix my view so I can see everyone. And thank you for the emojis. Looks lovely. All right, so for the questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask the question, or I know some of us are introverts, so if you don't feel like unmuting, you can always put your question in the chat and I can read it for you. So whatever you prefer. Any questions? If no one has questions, I can get started. So I have a ton of questions. But okay, so I'll get started. And this is a question. Oh, wait. Peggy. Or wait. Oh. Okay, so we have a question from Peggy for Melissa. Have you spent time in the canyon? And then Holly, and this is connected, can you talk about your research process for the book?
Yeah, sure. So yes, I have spent time in the canyon. Luckily, I live in Flagstaff, so it's kind of right around the corner for me. But specifically for this book, I knew I was going to have to run the Grand Canyon, which was pretty scary for me. I'd never done any kind of whitewater rafting before, so that was new. So I joined up with a botany crew that was going down and weeding out an invasive grass species. And so a lot of those descriptions that you heard are drawn from the diaries and the journals of these two women, but also from my personal experiences there. And yeah, the research process, I was really lucky to have kind of a treasure trove of documents. Both Elzada and Lois saved their diaries and letters, and Lois in particular was a pack rat. She saved everything to do with this trip that she did when she was 24 years old in 1938. And all of that's archived at Northern Arizona University. And then there's a few other archives around the country that have documents related to this trip. So there was a lot of material to tap into. And I'm really grateful to both these women for having the foresight to save all that material so that a writer like me could come along and tap into it.
Definitely. I think as writers, we're always collecting information and then figuring out how to put it together, which is fun, but it can also be very intimidating. There's a question for Kat Wilder. Does Kat Wilder have another book coming soon? I believe she does, but Kat?
Well, soon with a book is, I don't think those go together. No, I'll know tomorrow morning if I have a contract or not. That happens tomorrow morning. So sitting on eggshells here.
Well,
Thank
good
you
luck.
for the question.
We'll be thinking of you. Any other questions? I actually have a question for the three of you, and you can take it in any way that you want. So what I noticed from all of your readings is the power of observation, the idea of kinship, and then the idea of womanhood. And so, but also there is this representation of survival in many different ways. So for all of you, like, what is the relationship between womanhood, survival, and kinship? And you, again, you can take it in any way that you want. It's not like it's a very open question.
Nobody wants to go first. I'll go first. I was thinking about that too. It was kind of nice going last because I could hear both the cats, touch on themes that I thought about a lot when I was writing this book. The idea of danger. Kat Smith had some beautiful line in there about danger and beauty, which I'm not going to be able to quote exactly. But I think women moving into spaces, outdoor spaces, or really any kind of spaces, are hyper aware of danger in ways that men perhaps are not always. And I saw those threads in all three of the work, all kinds of dangers, like, Kat Smith and the aluminum, the lines about aluminum and sulfur, and Kat Wilder being in that kind of frightening place, looking at these mustangs, this like symbol of wildness in the midst of a prison, which is the opposite, right? And I think for my two women, they were very hyper aware that they were going into a dangerous place, not just because of the rapids and, the cliffs and the fact that there would be no rescue, but also because they were going down the river with strange men. And the reason why Elzada Clover invited Lois to go with her was because she knew that she needed another woman with her, that would make it safe. So, your question about kinship is, I think for so many of us, such a counterbalance to the dangers that we see in the world. We need those people we can trust around us, often other women, but also plants and animals and mustangs and, all of those things of beauty that we can tap into that help create places where we can feel more safe. That was a very rambling answer, but it was really cool seeing all of those threads in all of the readings today.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think I love that about finding kinship, not just with others people, but with other beings, with plants and animals. I think for me, I think of the poem I read, Today is the Day, about getting a mammogram, and that being the sort of experience that many women or people with breasts share that experience. And it's important for our survival to have this experience, and it's something that doesn't often get talked about in mainstream circles or society. And I think for me, finding ways to talk about the things that don't get talked about is a way of finding kinship, even if it's an experience that can be kind of solitary, but to find ways to talk about those things. And it helps us survive to know that there are others out there experiencing those things as well.
Yes, definitely. And that we can all relate to each other in some ways. Yeah. Thank you.
I think you should go on to another question.
Okay. Are you sure? Okay. So we have another question in the chat. Well, a couple. Melissa, what brought you to this project? What prompted you from George Kramer?
I found, I ran across a mention of these two women's names years ago. It was 2018. I was looking for something unrelated, and I stumbled across Lois's collection at NAU. And at first I didn't really want to write something about it. I wanted to read something about it. So I went looking for something I could learn about these two women. And there are a few things that have been written about them, but almost nothing talked about the science that they did, and almost nothing talked about their kind of inner lives, like their experience as women being in these male-dominated spaces. And that was the story that really fascinated me. So it kind of just sucked me in, and I started to write. I initially thought I'll write an article. I'll write like 1,000-word article, and then I'll be done with this story. And then I had 10,000 words, and I knew it was going to be a book. So.
Thank you, Constance. I see you. I'm gonna go to Rebecca, and then I'll come back to you. Rebecca says, all three of you wonderful writers touched on water and the desert and on growing aridity. How much are you seeing changes in your daily experience of wordsmithing as global change intensifies? It's a great question.
I think I can start with that. First of all, Becca Lawton is a wonderful writer of water and rivers, and her book, What I Never Told You, just came out recently, a few months ago. Anyway, I live sort of mostly outside and watch water daily. There's a creek that goes down below the cabin where I live, out next to the Mustangs, and I watch it daily. I watch it seasonally. I watch it rise. I watch it dry up. And it definitely is an expression of what's going on, in the world with everything. This year we had I'm in southwestern Colorado, so near Cortez, Mesa Verde. This year we had an amazing snow year, and so I watched the opposite of the drought years that we've had for the last several years, and it's fascinating and frightening, and I don't have an ultimate answer, just the experience of noticing daily what the water situation is in the sky, in the river, the creek, and having a lot of animals that are dependent on, well, all animals need water, but having horses and cattle, that water is my responsibility, getting them to water, dealing with water. I feel very, it's like inside of me, the dilemma, the constant change, the fear, all of that is just kind of my blood. And it was before, as when I was running rivers and stuff. Anyway, that's a lousy answer, but there you go.
Kat or Melissa?
I can go next. I think for me, like, Self-Portrait with Cephalopod there's a lot in that book about climate change and the grief associated with that, and grappling with my complicity in the deterioration of the environment. And I continue to write about those things, but what I've noticed for myself is that I'm turning more toward hope. And maybe, I don't know if I have hope for the planet to heal necessarily, but I have hope in other humans. I have hope in the power of relationship. I'm getting away a little bit from the question of aridity and water, but for me, it's all tied together. Yeah, I think I notice in my own writing just maybe the process of having written about it so much has kind of helped me move through that stage of grief to a point where I can see a little bit more of the hope that I find in relationship and other experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel that too, kind of the balance of grief and hope. In some ways I'm envious of Kat Wilder's kind of more intimate experience with water. I think those of us who aren't, ranchers or farmers or, river runners or something, where you really pay attention to those flows, it's very easy to stop paying attention. I grew up in Tucson drinking out of the Central Arizona Project, which was pumped uphill for my benefit, even though it was being pumped with coal dug from Navajo land, I didn't learn that until I grew up and started to research that, those horrible racist feedback loops in our water system. And now living in Flagstaff and being, tapped into a very deep aquifer, it's very easy for me and people like me to not pay attention to water if we don't want to. And so part of the thing I've been trying to cultivate in my writing since I was very young is paying attention, paying attention to the seasons, paying attention to the snowpack and the levels of the rivers and what the rivers look like when they flow and what are they like when they're dry, how important they are as dry corridors that are still these immense harbors of biodiversity. Where is my water coming from and who is harmed by the way we move around water? Those are all things I think about deliberately, but it would be easy not to, which is kind of the danger of the water situation in Arizona.
Thank you. I love the awareness and all of the answers. And that question, where does my water come from, is such an important one. And I think we don't really think about it enough. But if we did, it's kind of scary if we actually knew, right? And really got into it very deeply. Constance, please.
This really started out to be for Kathryn as one of your Eastern Washington neighbors, but I want to expand it out to Kat and Melissa as well. So you already spoke a little bit about how you're finding new hope in your writing, but I wonder if you could go a little further and talk about, and for all three of you, talk about how do you see your writing impacting or releasing grief over what is happening to the natural world around you. I know Kat lives very deeply within it. And Kathryn, when you talked about volatile VOCs touching on lung flesh, I've felt the way I feel every summer when that starts happening. And so I'm just wondering how your writing process, and particularly your writing process as you can think about it as women, if you see that as, I think we feel things, or we are more willing to write about our emotions. And do you feel that as being a release from grief or a new way of dealing with grief, or does it bring home some of those concerns and feelings of loss even deeper? So I'd just like to, if you could just grapple a little bit with that, the three of you, I'd really like to hear what you think. Thank you.
I can try to start. And I think maybe as a poet, it's going to be a little bit easier for me to answer this question, because when I sit down to write, I don't necessarily know what feelings are going to come up. I don't know what I'll start maybe with one idea and it'll lead to more and more, or I'll start with one feeling and it'll lead to more and more. And so the process of writing is really the process of me figuring out how I feel about something. So it does help me grapple with grief. It also helps me maybe come to new understandings. Yeah. I'll leave it at that.
For me, writing is it's a survival tool for me personally. For my little internal world. If I didn't write, I don't I really kind of don't think I'd be here. Sorry, sisters that are watching. But it has saved my life. So I think, again and again, I think my dilemma or concern is that because I do write personal stuff, even while I'm trying to take on a bigger topic, is like, am I focusing too much on me and not enough on her, the mother? So I just work at putting in a lot of detail of place, to draw attention to and give attention to, like I said, the mother, and to hope that people want to read it, and that maybe it makes a connection for them to place, and maybe helps them pay more attention to their immediate world, around them. And that I think by loving, even if it's just our backyard or our front yard or whatever, if we love that little place, that little area, then that maybe spreads outward. So I mean, so even while I'm writing to survive, I'm also hoping that it carries something and gives something to others and to the source.
Yeah, those are wonderful answers. It's such a rich, complex question to grapple with, Yeah, I think writing is a way to cope with grief. Not necessarily for me, not necessarily the words that I'm putting down the page. Like when I go to write about climate change, I'm not necessarily like, and now I must end with the solution and find the hope. Sometimes that can feel very, very shallow, and moments in our life, we need to really sit with the grief, like Kat Smith talked about, the apocalypse, right? Which is a very personal thing. But I think the act of writing, for me, the process of putting words down one after the other, is hopeful. There's some kind of hope that is generated by that, even if the words are a howl of grief. There's something about that process that helps me. I guess maybe it's the idea that, like, and then there's this, tomorrow there will be books, and tomorrow there will be libraries, and tomorrow there will be more words. And sometimes that's all we can do is hope for what's happening tomorrow. I don't know if that made any sense. I was getting metaphysical there, but that's how I feel.
Thank you. We actually have a question in the chat from Stephen Law. Once the book is for the three of you, once the book has been written, what was the getting published process like?
I can only laugh. I mean, it's not easy. It takes persistence and networking and friends and people, advice and persistence, just to keep at it. And I feel lucky that I found a publisher in Torrey House Press, which publishes a lot of books about the Colorado Plateau and the West. I felt very lucky that they took Desert Chrome, and I didn't, I guess, I don't know if I cheat or what, but there's the finding a publisher and then there's the finding an agent. They're kind of two different things. And I have struck out on finding an agent, and I have put my energies more toward finding a publisher, even if they're small presses. I think that's just the way it's going to be for me. And the other thing about publishing that I just want to say is, like, after the book comes out, I don't know, this was my experience this time. It's been a long time since I published a book, but this time was just that postpartum depression, and that, like, oh my God, okay, it's out. There's the few weeks of like wild sort of celebration and talks and tours. Well, it was during COVID, so there were minimal tours, but then it was like, oh shit, now what do I do? Like, I don't have another one on the burner right now. What do I do? Where do I put that energy? What do I do with that time. That was probably the, I don't know, the hardest part of the process. Okay.
I can just add to that, my first 2 books were with the university presses, and university presses are just a wonderful resource in the world. Like, they publish works that they consider to be important, scholarly important, but not necessarily works that are going to sell a lot of copies and make a lot of money. And so that was really a process of like having a story I wanted to tell that was like, a little narrow slice of a story, and finding the right press for that story, kind of a matchmaking sort of process. This one was different because I did have an agent for this one, and that tossed me up into a whole kind of new world of having a team of people who were going to help me with the publication process and the publicity process. And so that's a whole different kettle of fish, and it's exciting, also a little nerve-wracking. Stephen, you have my email, so if you have more specific questions, I'm being kind of general, feel free to reach out by email. Yeah, I echo everything Kat just says. It's kind of mysterious, I think, even for those of us who have done it. So I don't know if Kathryn Smith has anything to add about publishing poetry.
I think Kat might have got disconnected.
Yeah, I
don't-
think we lost her, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, she can. See
She's
if she-
back.
Oh,
She's
good.
back.
Okay.
Sorry, my internet was not behaving there for a moment. Is it my turn to answer a question?
Yes. About publishing.
Publishing process, right. I think for one thing that's different for poets versus fiction or nonfiction writers is that I don't know of any poets who work with an agent. You're pretty much on your own. So it was about 10 years with this particular book, of arranging and revising and sending out to contests and collecting rejections and rearranging again and sending to more contests, and finally starting to get some positive feedback. Yeah, I ended up publishing with Milkweed, which is a beautiful press, and I feel really lucky to have ended up with them. And the actual process itself of working with them was interesting because it was the book came out in early 2021. So during 2020, I was working with them as they were figuring out what was even happening and what was possible in a pandemic, not knowing, for a while, it was like, maybe books are carrying this virus, and so maybe we can't publish books anymore. I mean, it was just, there were so many questions. So we were kind of figuring it out together. And I previously worked with small presses of just a handful of people, which is great because I had a very personalized experience working with Milkweed. There's things like, I have a publicist. I don't have to worry about letting people know about the book because people know who this publisher is. So I find that there are benefits with very small presses and benefits with publishers that are more well-known as well. And I missed what Melissa said because my internet froze, but I resonate with everything that Kat said about just that it takes persistence. It just takes not giving up. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good reminder too, that we need to be persistent, and sometimes it takes years and it's not really up to us. We never know who's on the other side reading our work. So one of the best things a mentor said to me is that, and for me as a poet, every book has a home and you'll find it. It's just a matter of, continuing to send out the work. Do we have any more questions? Oh, Kathy, hi. Thank you for coming. I do have one last question. I know Melissa answered a question about her research and the process for writing the book. For Kat, what was that process like?
I was on a panel at the Tucson Festival of Books that Melissa was emceeing or facilitating, and that question, a question about research came up, and Cy Montgomery was on the panel, and she answered first, and she said, I do all my research first. She spends months, years, whatever, gathering all the details, everything she can about turtles or octopuses or whatever her topic is. And then she sits down and writes the book. And I was like, I do completely the opposite. I write the book, and then I do the like natural history of horses in North America or whatever. Then I do the research, and I weave it in. I find the places that it might fit, but I definitely do research last. The hands-on research, like sitting there and watching Mustangs, that was easy. That was traveling and going to some of the places I went, and that was wonderful. But the more the more factual, more sort of journalism kind of writing that had to go in there, I put that off till last.
For me, it really varies from poem to poem. Some poems I definitely researched, like the sulfur poem. I definitely did research about sulfur. And I do have a lot of kind of sciencey kinds of things in my book. And it's really just whatever interests me is what prompts me to do the research. And some poems are just all based on my own experience and require no research whatsoever, except for maybe trying to look at old photographs or, ask someone in my family, do you remember this happening? So there's not one way to do research as a poet, I guess.
I agree. And it's so much fun because you can research about anything and just have fun with it and see where it leads you. Thank you. Okay, so we are almost at time. We have a few more minutes. Does anyone else have questions, comments? I know there are tons of comments in the chat, so and we'll get a copy of it, but you can sort of read through it. All lovely. So any more questions?
Well, let me jump in, Leo, not with a question, but just with thanks. Thanks for this amazing reading by Melissa and Kat and Leo. Thank you for your wonderful hosting and the great questions we had and the cats that we saw running through or walking through the Zoom screen. Melissa, particularly your cat, sort of in figuring out the handle there. I've got a couple dogs behind me, but I love cats as well. I think we're there with the questions. Again, such a wonderful evening. Thank you all. This is being recorded and we'll post it on the YouTube channel so folks can do it there. Leo, any last words?
Just very, very grateful and appreciative. I'm inspired. I want to read all of your books and now I want to do some research too. This is really cool. Thank you.
Yes. So again, thanks again to our wonderful readers this evening and to our audience. And I hope you all have a lovely evening.